You on now? Yeah, there we go. I'm just waiting on a bell. So I know it's time to get started, but I guess it is time, bell or no bell. Plus, hopefully everything's working in there. We're having, nowadays with all the streaming and everything else that we're doing, you almost need like experience in tech support to be able to get everything going on Sunday morning. We had some problems. We never were able to get the streaming for class last week, even though we did for worship. And I was in there before we got started now, and I think I've got it all set up where it's going to work, but the problem is our settings aren't saving anymore for some reason. I've got to try to get in here tomorrow and see if I can't figure out what the deeper underlying issue is. I think we've got it ready to go today, but anyway, it just seems like just about every week we're here running around like chickens with our heads cut off, trying to get everything all ready to go before we get going. But with all that said, I did hear the bell, so I know it's time. We're in Job chapters 29 through 31 today, what is called his avowal of innocence. At least most scholars describe it that way. And I'm going to put up here the outline again, if we get that pulled back up. Let's see, I just tried this, and I know it was working because I had it working. There we go. Okay. So we've got this up here because I know some people said that this is helpful for them, and I do think it's good. Sometimes when we start drilling into these specifics in each chapter, you can miss the forest for the trees, so we want to remember the big overall shape of the book here. We summarized that a couple of weeks ago. We all know all the bad things that happened to Job because he's held up as this test case, and because of that, he's afflicted by Satan to see if he really is going to remain faithful. Does he serve God for no reason, as it says there in the prologue? He loses all his possessions, he loses his children, he loses his physical health. And ultimately that causes him to break out in this curse lament in chapter 3, where I wish I wasn't born, and if I had been born, well, I wish I'd been stillborn. He wishes he'd never lived. That's how dismal his condition is. And that's what shocks the friends, his three friends who've come to visit him, into finally speaking, which is the bulk of the book, chapter 4 through chapter 27, where one of them will speak and then Job will respond. And their thesis, you remember, it's rooted in this worldview, what we call the doctrine of retribution. That is that the righteous are blessed without exception, the wicked are punished, they suffer without exception. Because Job is suffering so greatly, Job must be a sinner. That's their worldview, and that's the only way they can reason through this. Now, Job realizes that, no, he hasn't sinned in any way. It's not that he's perfect, but he hasn't sinned in any way that's commensurate with that suffering that he's experiencing. And so he tries to talk to them. No, you're wrong. That's not my experience. And over time, the two sides just harden, where at first the friends are kind of cautiously advancing this. By the end, they're accusing Job of these specific heinous crimes. Job, meanwhile, realizes he's not going to really find any sort of comfort, any resolution from his friends, so he increasingly turns his attention toward resting his case with God. Now, last week, we looked at chapter 28, this interlude here, which we said is by the inspired author, this hymn in praise of wisdom. It stands outside the dialogue, and it points us to what's most important here. Chapter 28, verse 28, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil, that's understanding. That's what this book is all about. It's important that we keep that in mind. That's what the contest between God and Satan, if we want to call it that, over Job is about. Is he going to continue to fear God? Is he going to turn away from evil? That's the resolution we'll find in the end, but we need to keep that in mind in the midst of this suffering. But now we get back to Job speaking, and you'll notice 29 verse 1, Job again took up his discourse. So it's a pointer there that he wasn't speaking before, I think. But that's this section here, chapters 29 through 31. Where Job is going to take this final step of attempting to clear himself with this avowal of innocence. He's going to take an oath that's designed to force the issue here. He's been appealing to God, wanting resolution, wanting an explanation for why all of this has happened to him. And the idea of this oath with these curses, he's swearing that he's innocent, he hasn't done anything wrong. The idea of this oath is that God either is going to have to clear his name or else he's going to have to activate the curses. One way or the other, we're going to get some resolution to all of this. And of course, even if God remains silent, even if God doesn't come down and speak to him, that would be an answer in itself. Because if those curses that he calls in aren't activated, well, then that's going to say to everyone around there, well, God must be vindicating him. He must be innocent. Now, this avowal of innocence, as we called it, consists of 3 parts, divided up into 3 different chapters. Chapter 29, Job remembers his past abundant life. Chapter 30, we have a lament in contrast to the past. That is his present experience. He's lamenting it in contrast to what he enjoyed before. And then chapter 31 is the oath of innocence proper. That oath is the focal point of these 3 chapters. And through it, Job is demanding this legal judgment on his character from God. Chapters 29 and 30, as we said, by contrast, portray the depth of Job's affliction, where they're in a pair. In chapter 29, we got the good old days. In chapter 30, then, we have what he's experiencing now. It's that idea back in chapter 1, the Lord gave, the Lord is taken away. Well, we see the Lord, what he gave in chapter 29 and what he's taken away in chapter 30. But those ideas give us the foundation, the background to that oath he's going to take in chapter 31. And this is all drawing on ancient Near Eastern legal customs. If someone were suffering because of an accusation that somebody had made against them, they had the option, this is somewhat different from our legal system, but if the accuser refused to file a formal complaint, that is, if they were just going around talking about you, spreading these tales about you, and if you were suffering real economic, social harm from that, but they didn't take you to court, well, then you, as a defendant, could actually raise a case in court. You could demand a trial, demand that they show the evidence there that they're defaming you with. And in that case, a defendant might swear an oath that he was innocent, and that was in an effort to force the hand of his accuser. In the ancient Near East, this was a pretty common legal practice. In that oath, this person was placing themselves really in the hand of God to decide their fate. So that's the background we're drawing on here. That's the step Job will take in seeking vindication, particularly there in chapter 31. And I do think we should remember that this oath that he's taking reminds us one more time of the fact that he feels he's innocent, that he's going to be vindicated by God. This whole time through the dialogue, for those of you who weren't here as we worked our way through it, we see this increasing tension in Job's speeches, where on the one hand he wonders, why is God doing this to me? Why is he afflicting me? He feels alienated from God, as if he's the cause of all this. But then on the other hand, Job still presses through that, and he trusts God, and he believes God is just and righteous, and ultimately he's going to vindicate him. So there's those 2 ideas that he's grappling with, in tension with each other. Well, we see that here in this oath, because if Job didn't really believe that God was just, and he didn't really believe that he was innocent and that he'd be vindicated, well, then it wouldn't make any sense for him to take an oath like this with all these curses he's calling down upon himself. If he didn't have that confidence in God, then it would be foolish, because he'd just be cursed. But we also see, one more time in the structure here, you see how we have the dialogue in between chapter 3 and chapters 29 and 31. This is the sort of a balancing here in the structure of the book. Remember, it's that curse lament when Job says, I wish I'd never been born. It's that shocks the friends so much that they decide to speak. And then they go back and forth. Job increasingly turns to God, and here finally he rests his case completely with God in taking this oath of innocence. And this shuts the friends up. They don't speak anymore after this, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad, because they don't have anything left to say. And in fact, after this, only God can really give a proper answer. Now, 3 chapters. We obviously can't cover all 3 chapters today, so our goal since 29 and 30 are really flip sides of the same coin, our goal, we're going to try to cover both of those chapters this morning. Even though that's still a good bit of material, they are at least pretty straightforward in their meaning. And then we'll get into that more complicated material of the actual oath of innocence in chapter 31 next week. There we go. All right. So, chapter 29. This is where Job remembers the good old days, as we've called it up there. He remembers that time when God blessed him. And we have a detailed description throughout this chapter of his former stature in the community, of this intimate relationship that he enjoyed with God, of the fact that everybody recognized that relationship that he had. They recognized that he was in God's favor, and they respected him. But despite all that, Job didn't just become arrogant and boastful and rest on his laurels there. He actually tried to help people who were poor and oppressed and unfortunate. And because he was so confident in the fact that he'd pleased God, he looked forward to this long, prosperous life. And of course, it's that past life that's going to serve as the contrast to the shame that he's feeling there in the present. But there are 5 sections, really, just to give you the lay of the land. God's rich blessing on him in verses 1 through 6. We'll see Job's past honor in verses 7 through 10. His striving after justice in verses 11 through 19. His hope for a long, blessed life in verses 19 through 20. And then back again to that theme of him being a respected elder in verses 21 through 25. But we'll read through each of these in order. Chapter 29, verse 1. Job again took up his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when the children were all around me, when my steps were washed with butter, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil." So, as I said, these 2 chapters are really pretty straightforward. How would you sum up this section? What are those 6 verses about? Somebody tell me.
I remember when God was good to me.
Yeah, that's straightforward. It's the gist of it. His life had been good, and he acknowledges it was a gift from God. When God was good to me, Robert said, if you didn't hear that. He had all of these great blessings here. He had many children. He had a happy, prosperous life. And above all else, he had God's friendship. So he remembers those times when God nourished and he protected his life there in verse number 2. And I think that reminds us, it's important that we recall in the midst of all the rest of this suffering, the fundamental reason for Job's suffering, underlying everything else, is this sense of spiritual alienation that he's suffering. That is, he felt like he had this close fellowship, this relationship with God, and that's, to his mind, that's been severed, and he doesn't understand why. And that, more than anything else, is eating away at him. But you see, God had set his lamp to shine above Job's head, and we all know how light in Scripture is a symbol of blessing and of success, and God's light gave him direction, and when it gave him that direction, Job obeyed because he followed that light. He walked in it. And he was in the prime of his life. In verse number 4, God was that friend in his tent, giving him counsel, giving him protection. In particular, you see this really sad note there. He was filled with happiness because his children were there all around him, those children that he's lost now that were a concrete sign of God's blessing. Verse 6, I think, is particularly evocative there. When my steps were washed with butter and the rock poured out for me streams of oil. Those represent just how abundantly he was blessed, because this butter, or some translations will say cream or curds, but the whole idea there is he's so blessed figuratively he could wash his feet in cream if he wanted to. And he was so blessed that it was like the rocks themselves were pouring out olive oil for him, which you know how valuable that was in the ancient world. It's still pretty expensive today, the good stuff is. So the whole idea is Job was abundantly blessed by God. Verses 7 through 10, then, we turn slightly from God's blessing to the honor that he enjoyed. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew, and the aged men rose and stood. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. So what's this all about? Yeah, Job was highly respected in the community. He's accustomed to go to the city gate and sit there with the elders. Now, if you remember anything from lots of places in the Old Testament, the most picturesque scene I can think of this is in the book of Ruth, where Boaz goes to the city gate. But you remember, this is where all public business was conducted. The broad area outside the main gate, this was the hub of an ancient city. It was the place of business, of government. There was usually a market that was set up there. Citizens would gather to discuss news and to exchange ideas, and in particular, the elders would assemble there. They'd make decisions. They might even hold ad hoc court cases where they'd form a little council there. Someone would act as a judge if there was a complaint. At most any time, citizens could assemble a jury there like that. If you remember Amos chapter 1, verse 5, Amos says, justice took place in the gate. That's where this imagery comes from. But as Jerry said, the whole idea here is when Job entered the gate of the city, everybody noticed. Everybody was deferential. The young men saw him and they stood aside. The old men saw him and they all rose and stood silently. Even the princes, the officials of the city, they'd hush. They'd stop speaking. In fact, they laid their hand on their mouth. That's a signal for silence there in the assembly. Everyone would hush and be respectful when Job showed up. Then we see really sort of the reasoning for that respect he was accorded, his striving after justice. Verse 11, when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it approved. Because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made him drop his prey from his teeth. So what's this all about? It's again pretty straightforward. Yeah, his service to others. That's a good way to sum it up. Why does everybody show deference to Job? Why is it when he goes into the city gate that people stand and they hush? Because of these deeds of service, these acts of charity to a lot of different people. And in fact, verse 11 there, everybody who heard about Job blessed him. Everyone who saw him commended him because he came to the aid of the poor and the orphans who were crying. We all know, or we should know, in the Old Testament, and this doesn't just go for the Jewish religion, you find this a lot in the ancient Near East, but it taught particularly care for the poor, for widows, for orphans, and that's because those were the marginalized elements in society, the powerless, the people who couldn't take care of themselves, and so they were ripe for being abused and oppressed by people. God was particularly concerned about these groups, and so those who were righteous, who reflected God's character and his concern, they'd take care of these groups too. And so Job says he's been faithful to that standard. Anyone who was so destitute, verse 13, that he was about to perish, he blessed Job. He took care of widows to the point that he inspired them to sing. And these attributes were just as visible to people as if he wore them like clothing. Everybody could see it. You can think about how your character spoken of as clothing in Scripture a lot. I think about the armor of God, for instance, in Ephesians 6. It's a similar idea. Job says he wore these things like a robe and like a turban. You could see it in these deeds of mercy he did for people who were handicapped. He says, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He did things for them that they couldn't do for themselves. And he took up the cause of the stranger even, which would have been another vulnerable element in society. I mean, strangers are vulnerable even today, right? That guy, he's not from around here. I don't know him. I don't know his people. That sort of attitude. When something goes wrong, people are likely to point at the stranger, the one who's an outsider. Job carefully investigated the facts. It says, I searched out the cause of him I did not know. Whereas a court might have been organized to quickly render a verdict against those outsiders, Job says, no, I performed justice. I actually investigated the cause. I didn't just write him off because he was an outsider. And in fact, in verse 17, Job went even further than that, because he not only helped those who were oppressed, but he tried to break the oppressors. He wanted to put those people out of commission. People who, that word fangs, that expresses just how cruel they were. People here who were like wild animals. But Job championed those who were abused, and he snatched them from the jaws of their oppressors just like they were prey. And because of all that, verse 18, looks like I inadvertently skipped one. Verses 18 through 20 have to do with his hope then for a long, blessed life. Then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My roots spread out to the waters with the dew all night on my branches. My glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand. Now that's pretty straightforward. Because of all this, Job expected to have a long and happy and blessed life and to enjoy a peaceful death. Because of the way he'd been blessed by God and his pursuit of what was right. Remember, Job believed prior to his experience, just like his friends believed, in this doctrine of retribution. And the righteous are going to be blessed without any exception. Well, Job was righteous. Everybody knew that he was. And so he expected to experience these abundant material, spiritual blessings, and to die of old age peacefully. You have him pictured there like a tree. Fits the image of the righteous. I think of the first psalm here in particular, like a tree that's planted there by the waters. That's what the righteous is like. His roots are spreading out here so that he could weather any sort of adversity. And he thought even in his old age he would continue to have a vigorous life. That's how he'd be blessed. My bow ever new in my hand. That symbolizes his physical prowess there. That is, that he would continued to remain energetic, healthy, up to the point of his death, that God would just continue to bless him. We return then finally to this theme of his respect again in verses 21 through 25. Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After I spoke, they did not speak again, and my word dropped upon them. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouths as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they had no confidence, and the light of my face they did not cast down. I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. So, again, it's that theme of respect in the community. He emphasizes it here, and particularly that theme of respect in the city council. People expectantly, remember they were quiet when Job entered. Well, here they were quiet because they were listening for his advice. And when he spoke, no one dared to oppose him. That's how respected his opinion was. His rhetoric was so powerful, nobody would go up against Job. And these evocative images there in verse 22 and 23 in particular, they drank up his wisdom just like the parched ground. It was like rain falling upon them. That's how eager they were to hear what Job had to say. he hoped through that counsel to inspire people. And in fact, in verse 24 there, when people lacked confidence, when they weren't sure, he would smile upon them. And it says that essentially they couldn't believe that. Hey, Job's on my side, or Job smiled at me. He was this inspirational leader. And that prompted people to appoint him as chief in verse 25. That really encompasses every role that he had here in the community, leading them in peace, guiding people in counsel, maybe even serving as a leader when they went into battle. The imagery there of like a king living among his troops, comforting them, caring for the unfortunate. Job was the leader in his community in all seasons. So that's what his life was like before. But now, that's how chapter 30, verse 1 begins. But now, and that's where we see the contrast here. Now, everything's changed. And he laments that change and the depth of his shame and of his suffering. And he's so distressed too, again, as we've said, because he sees God's hand behind all of this suffering. And that absolutely exasperates him because he doesn't understand where he went wrong. And the fact that God's silent in the face of all this, that he won't give him an answer to why he's suffering, that just compounds all of his frustration. And that, but now, as I've said, that points us the way here to the lament. Three sections here, really. He's going to talk about the abuse he's experienced from men, verses 1 through 15. Then he's going to make an accusation against God, verses 16 through 23. And then finally he wraps it all up with a lamentation in verses 24 through 31. So, abuse from men, first of all. He's talked about how great everything was before, but now they laugh at me. Men who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. What can I gain from the strength of their hands, men whose vigor is gone? Through want and hard hunger they gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. They pick saltwort and the leaves of bushes and the roots of the broom tree for their food. They're driven out from human company. They shout after them as after a thief. In the gullies of the torrents they must dwell, in holes of the earth and of the rocks. Among the bushes they bray. Under the nettles they huddle together. A senseless, a nameless brood, they've been whipped out of the land. And now I have become their song. I'm a byword to them. They abhor me. They keep aloof from me. They do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me. Because God has loosed my cord and humbled me, they've cast off restraint in my presence. On my right hand the rabble rise. They push away my feet. They cast up against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They need no one to help them. As through a wide breach they come. Amid the crash they roll on. Terrors are turned upon me. My honor is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. So how would you describe, how would you summarize this section here? Not everybody all at once. Yeah, they turned against him. And what does he think about? How does he describe these people who've turned against him? What does he think of them, first of all? Yeah, disgust, not only for the way they're treating him, but for their background. These are a bunch of worthless fellows here. They're young, which of course in the ancient world you're to respect your elders, and Job is, at least was, this respected elder, and here they're these whippersnappers who are disrespecting him, but they're not merely young, they're coarse, they're undesirable. And then he talks about how they treat him. That's really verses 1 through 8 when he talks about them themselves. Then verses 9 through 15, he really describes their mockery. But they're just a bunch of rabble here. because of their youth, because of their lowly status, as deplorable as they are to others, they feel like they have the right to mock Job. In fact, Job says that these guys are so low that their fathers were unworthy to be put with his dogs. Now, you've heard, if you've been here on Sunday morning, in a recent sermon, we talked about how the Hebrews viewed dogs, wild scavengers, even the ones that they kept here to watch the flocks. They weren't like beloved pets. And so, if somebody's not even worthy to be out with the dogs, that's about as low as a person can possibly get. And he talks about all the negative characteristics this group had. They lack strength, they lack vigor, they're gaunt from hunger, they're just roaming there for food. In verse 4, they're so destitute, they pluck saltwort, which was a plant that you would only eat in the most desperate circumstances because it's right there in the name. It tasted really salty. It's not something you would eat if you had anything else to do. They collect the roots there from the broom tree, which was another plant out there in the desert. And when these guys, this rabble, enters a city, the citizens are just appalled. They drive them out of polite society. They call them thief. And so they have to go and find shelter out in the wilderness, huddling out there among the shrubs. That's why they're foraging for food like this. They're a foolish and a nameless brood there in verse number 8. Literally, they're sons of a fool and sons without a name. And you know, in the ancient world, your name is everything. And he says these guys, they don't have any sort of name. They have no honor. So that's the type of people that he's talking about here. This young riffraff, people who don't respect their elders, people who are from this low background, people who are driven out of towns in polite society. These are the types of people who now feel they can mock Job. And he describes their mockery here. They have this mocking song for him. This man who was the noblest elder in the community has now become a byword. That is, everybody knows about the story. You don't be like old Job, or it looks like he's pulled a Job, when bad things happen to you, so forth. They express their contempt with offensive gestures. They even spit in his face if they pass him. But Job actually looks beyond all that, and here we see that spiritual suffering again. He sees God as the cause of his disgrace. God has loosed his cord, he says there, and affected him. And the imagery there is like a tent, where you have that central cord in there. It's been pulled, and so the whole thing's sagging in. It doesn't have any sort of support there. They've attacked Job with such force that he likens it to besieging a city. That's really verses 12 through 14 there, that this imagery of pushing their way up on the side, like casting a siege ramp against him. And Job says this has proved his undoing. His suffering is just increasing with no sort of relief. And eventually they make a breach in the wall then, and they push through. So this is describing these terrors that he's feeling. His dignity, his prosperity, all these things have been driven away before him. And we've seen this hint already of attributing this to God's act. Now he's going to directly accuse God. Verse 16, "And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about like the collar of my tunic. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You've turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind, you make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living." So this, again, I think is pretty straightforward, and that Job now, he's going to accuse God directly of being the cause of all of these bad things that have happened to him. And in fact, he turns at a point in there to directly addressing God. No matter how much he cries out, God remains heedless. God doesn't hear his cry, and in fact, God's going to punish him more cruelly. He talks here about the pain that continually pierces his body. He has no strength left. He can't sleep. Verse 17, his body aches to the point that he likens it here to God grabbing his clothing and binding him up tightly, tighter than the collar of his tunic. And I think probably my garment is disfigured. It's probably a reference to his skin here and that disease, that disfigurement that he has throughout his body. But after all that, God cast him out into the mire to disgrace him. Job's been made to feel like the dust and the ashes. Remember that he's sitting on out there in the ash heap, the city dump, basically. He has no honor left. And even though he's asked repeatedly, because that's what the dialogue is all about, fervently petitioned God for some sort of answer here and for relief, God remains silent. God doesn't even acknowledge him in his view. And so he complains that God's just become cruel towards him. He's persecuting him hatefully. And in particular, those last couple of verses, sometimes God, you see this in the Psalms, God is pictured as riding on the wings of deliverance for his people. Job turns that around. God's tossed him around with the wind. He's abusing him here. And Job says, I know I'm being worn down to death. And so then finally he sums this all up. Verse 24, yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand and in his disaster cry for help? Did not I weep for him whose day was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came. And when I waited for light, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil and never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I go about darkened, but not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep. So Job sums this all up here. He mourns his fate, thinking of just how completely undeserved it is. Job has always assumed that when a person cries out to God, God's going to deliver them. He's going to save them. But instead, he says, God hasn't responded to his cries. And the rhetorical questions here, didn't I weep for him whose day was hard? Wasn't my soul grieved for the needy? It accuses God, in essence, of failing to act the way Job did. Job did these good things we've seen before. He acted for the oppressed, but here God's not even measuring up to Job's righteousness. Job wept for people in hard circumstances. Job was grieved on account of the poor, and Job expected that God would reciprocate, that he would feel the same thing for him, and he would offer some sort of blessing in response. And for a lot of years, his belief was supported by his prosperity. He thought he was blessed because of the way he served God, but now everything's been turned upside down, and so he's in this terrible pain. His skin has been blackened, that is, it's just rotting. He says it's not from the sun. He's not getting a tan. He's just rotting here from his illness, and his continuous lamenting associates him with the jackals and the ostriches. The jackal's howl is mournful. It's said to sound, I've never heard a jackal in person or anything, but they say it sounds just like a child that's wailing or that's crying, and an ostrich gives out these hissing, moaning sounds. Those sorts of cries that are painful to people, that's what Job sounds like. And that's what this section then is summing up all about. So, in the end here, this chapter, Job suffers totally, and we see the full dimension of his suffering. His body is bent over by pain. That's the physical suffering. His skin is rotting. He can't get any sleep because his bones ache so much, so he's suffering physically. He's suffering emotionally. Obviously, he's incredibly distraught from all this he's going through. He's suffering socially because now, where he was respected before, he's being taunted by the dregs of society. He's an outcast, a pariah. and he's suffering spiritually because he feels completely and totally alienated from God. His suffering is complete. You can't imagine any more dimensions than that. And that contrast between his former blessing and respect and his present state is stark. He feels like he's been abandoned by everyone. And this is a lament of that scope of his misery. So it's against this background, the good old days and that lament of what he's suffering now, that Job is going to offer that oath of innocence in chapter 31. This lament here just underscores the depth of his conviction and why he's so desperate that he feels like this is the only step that he has left, to swear this oath and to try to force God to give him an answer for why all this is happening to him. Anybody with a question or a comment at this point? Yeah. Well, I think that's why, if you didn't hear Glenda say, this is kind of the way that we are when we feel like we've cried out to God and he doesn't answer us, or maybe he says, not now, or we don't understand. That's why I think that this book is such it's a timely study for us right now with everything we're going through in 2020, but it's also timeless in that this is this is all wrapped up in our condition as humans. We have to deal with this constantly throughout our lives. So the questions that Job has are really the questions that we have. Why is this happening to me? Why do bad things happen to good people, as we put it? And that's really the answer that Job's seeking. That's what's going to prompt him to offer that oath, to try to force God to answer him. We'll look at that in chapter 31 next week. Thanks for your attention this morning.